everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the first in-person event of the program on Central Asia this semester. We are very honored to have Dr. Diego Benning Wang with us, who will tell us about the celebration of the Ferdowsi, very famous poet. I shouldn't even talk about it. I will let you introduce the topic, but let me introduce the speaker. Dr. Diego Benning Wang is a historian of the Caucasus, Armenia, Central Asia, and the Russian North in the modern period. He received his PhD in history from Princeton University and an MA in Russian studies from Columbia University and a BA in Russian studies from New York University. He speaks, reads, writes, and conducts research in 13 languages, including, well, obviously English, but also Spanish, Russian, Ukrainian, Chinese, Portuguese, French, Italian, Armenian, both Eastern and Western Armenian, Georgian, Uyghur, Uzbek, and Belarusian. In addition, he has reading proficiency in Crimean Tatar, Kazakh, and classical Chinese. He's currently a visiting scholar at the Davis Center, but previously he had been a visiting scholar at Columbia University and taught at Princeton University, King University, and Union County College. Diego, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the generous introduction, most of which is based on things I have previously written about myself. And thanks to those of you who are attending in person for braving the waning days of the New England winter. So today's talk is on the 1934 celebration of the Millennium in honor of the birth of the medieval Persian epic poet Abu Qasim Ferdowsi, which took place in the Soviet Union in the fall of the year 1934. And just to situate this event in the broader historical and ideological background, I'd like to say just a little bit about the nationalities policy and the ideological basis of the ideological policy in the Stalinist period following Stalin's consolidation of power, particularly in the mid and late 1930s. So the 1930s is often known as a period of dramatic advances made in the modernization of the Soviet state, from the building of the military-industrial complex, the collectivization of agriculture, the enslavement of the entire peasant population across the Soviet state, rapid proletarianization of the population, and rapid urbanization, all unfolding under the looming specter of the Stalinist terror. Nevertheless, on the cultural front, the modernization of the Soviet state took an interesting form. So as you may see in this image, which some of you may recognize, it has appeared in numerous monographs and other works on history of this period, particularly ones focusing on the nationality policy in the Stalinist period. So the background indicates that this is taking place in the political center of the Soviet Union, the Red Square, with Lenin's mausoleum in the background. And in the air, you have a formation of Soviet fighter jet, indicating, well, this was the period when the Soviet Union had one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, air forces in the country. And you have representatives of the 11 Soviet titular republics marching in unison, hoisting banners with the exact same slogan, greeting to the great Stalin. And with the exception of the gentleman at the very front, each and every one of them is sporting an ethnic costume that bore little imprint of the dramatic revolutionary changes that had taken place in the 2 decades since the Russian Revolution. And this is an indication of the turn of the cultural policy in the broader backdrop of the Stalin's nationality policy in institutionalizing the ethno-national territorial configuration of the Soviet Union. The modernization efforts made on the cultural front were rooted in raw material drawn from the pre-revolutionary, pre-Bolshevik past. And this is indeed ingrained in the Stalinist conceptualization of the nation, which was predicated on the four pillars of a shared territory, shared language, shared national economy, and a shared psychological makeup expressed in national culture. National culture being, well, manifestations of national characters such as literature, architecture, arts, and so on and so forth. In other words, a rather salient, rather vivid facade of national particularity, national specificity, national characteristics that concealed a rather sinister, rather monotonous and formulaic core of the Soviet commonality rooted deeply in the Marxist-Leninist ideology. So in terms of culture, prior to Stalin's consolidation of power and even into the early and mid 1930s, on the cultural front, some of the people spearheading the cultural campaign, particularly in the non-Slavic borderland regions of the Soviet Union, were promoting folklore largely transmitted orally through what a lot of scholars have labeled the revolutionary folklore, and some of these works of revolutionary folklore feature Lenin as his main character, his main theme, which gave rise to this notion of La Leniniana, which never fully faded throughout the Soviet period. And as the creative intelligentsia regroup in the 1930s, this took a change. So here are just some examples of the revolutionary folklore based on the oral literary traditions that promoted revolutionary themes. Here's a tale, supposedly an Uzbek tale about the death of God. God in this context being Tsar Nicholas II, and Lenin and Stalin obviously endowed with supernatural power or floating in the air, and they just randomly bumped into Tsar Nicholas II. And following a brief verbal exchange, the two Soviet leaders ended up decapitating Tsar Nicholas II, bringing forth, well, precipitating in the death of God. And some literary figures that rose to prominence during this period were paradoxically themselves illiterate. For example, many of you in this room may be familiar with the Kazakh Akhund Zhambul. And this is another literary figure coming from southern Dagestan, the Lezgi community, Stal Suleiman, or Suleiman Stalsky, and some of the themes that were commonplace in the revolutionary folkloric literature glorify renegades, rebels, insurgents, and so on and so forth. But this all changed with the regrouping of the creative intelligentsia led by the newly consolidated Stalinist leadership at the turn of the 1930s. And this crystallized in the First Writers' Congress, which took place in Moscow in July 1934, during which political and cultural figures, most notably Andrei Zhdanov and Maxim Gorky, provided the guidelines in the new cultural policy of the Soviet Union. And what was this policy about other than the displacement of the promotion of revolutionary folklore? Well, this new cultural paradigm included, among other things, the celebration and, in my word, monumentalization of pre-revolutionary literary icons, particularly the pre-revolutionary literary icons identified with specific Soviet nations. And one of the first such events was the 1932 centenary in honor of the death of Goethe. This event took place in Moscow in March 1932. It lasted only 2 days, and it was limited to a select group of bureaucrats and cultural figures. Nevertheless, this set the tone for the later such literary jubilees, which took place often on a much larger scale. And as you can see in the headline of the Soviet Literary Gazette, all the good to his greatness belongs to the proletariat. And proletariat in this context, it's just a euphemism for the Soviet state, which proclaimed itself as the leader of the proletariat, one of the only two states that were ruled by communist, Marxist-Leninist regimes in this period. Interestingly, in Soviet Belarus in the mid-1920s, there was a similar event, but it was quickly swept under the rug. I'd be happy to answer more questions about this in the Q&A. And the best such events, the best known such event, not necessarily the most important one, definitely not the first one, was the 1937 Pushkin Jubilee, which I will also be happy to talk about in the Q&A. But the topic of my talk today is the 1937 Ferdowsi Millennium, the event that I identified as the first all-union, all-people participatory literary jubilee of the Soviet Union. Just a few words about Ferdowsi and his magnum opus, Shahnameh. Shahnameh means, well, the letter of kings, the book of kings, or the tale of king variously, is the longest poem written by a single individual poet, a feat that would not be too difficult to achieve given today's technological advances if you're willing to copy and paste the same verses endlessly and call it a poem and proclaim yourself to be the author, which is something that I would not do. But if you do it, please be sure to let me know so that I will take that in mind next time I present on this topic. So Abul Qasim Ferdowsi wrote his magnum opus Shahnameh in the late 10th century, shortly after the Ghaznavid conquest of Persia. For the first time in history, Persia was under Turkic rule. And interestingly, Abul Qasim Ferdowsi was a native of the town of Tus, which is in the historical Khorasan region. Khorasan is today a province of Iran. A lot of things are unfolding in Iran. But historically, it was part of a much greater region that encompassed the modern territories of Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and many of you may recognize some of those countries were member republics of the Soviet Union, and this is very important, something that will come up again in my talk today. So the Pahlavi dynasty, this last name is coming up in the news a lot lately. Reza Shah Pahlavi, who had come to power just slightly over a decade earlier, he had previously served in the Cossack court in Qajar, Persia. He was trying to consolidate his legitimacy as the ruler of the state by staging grandiose commemorative events. The Ferdowsi Millennium being one of them. So around 1932, he decided to stage the Millennium in honor of the millennium of the birth of Ferdowsi in the year of 1934, even though a more accurate timeline would point that date to somewhere around 1935, 1936. And the decision quickly spread to Soviet political and cultural figures, which would eventually culminate in the staging of the same Jubilee in the Soviet Union, but with dramatically different reinterpretations of Ferdowsi's legacy and all kinds of celebratory activities. So the first people to pick up, the first representatives of the Soviet state to pick up on the decision to stage Ferdowsi's millennium in Persia, which will be named Iran shortly afterwards. These people were no doubt the Soviet diplomats posted to Persia. And interestingly, one of the first communiques that they sent to the Soviet government or their Soviet compatriots more broadly was not directly to the Soviet government, but rather to the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union, which was still transitioning from its headquarters in Leningrad to Moscow in the mid-1930s. And one of the first things that the Soviets did before passing a resolution to stage this Jubilee was to send a film crew to Persia to produce a documentary film on the progress that the Pahlavi dynasty had made since coming to power slightly over a decade earlier. And the film studio that was tasked with this documentary film was the Vostok Kino, which existed for roughly a decade, if not shorter. And this was the first and only documentary film on a foreign country this film studio ever produced. And I have not been able to find any footage from this film, but I did find descriptions about this film and some of the scenes in the film. And they were somewhat reminiscent of the reactions elicited by the early 1960s, I think it's 1963, Soviet film by the director Mikhail Kalatozishvili, Soy Cuba, I Am Cuba, which a lot of people consider to be infantilizing of the Cuban people or idealizing the Cuban Revolution. And indeed, throughout the film and also throughout some of the publications on the modernization in Persia that came out in 1933, 1934, a lot of the descriptions were also somewhat patronizing, somewhat condescending. Yeah, Persia is making tremendous progress in modernizing the country. However, there is still a lingering imperial specter. Persia is not fully free from European colonialism or imperialism, and Persia's resources were still partially dominated or controlled by European Western colonial interests. And the caricaturing or caricaturistic descriptions of the Persian population were also pretty befitting of some Russian literary tropes. For example, the chaikhana, the tea house, and people roasting kebab on the street. So in 1934, the commemoration of Ferdowsi was already political in the Soviet Union. A Jubilee committee was established in mid-1934, and it was to be headed by this gentleman, Abe Enukize, who would shortly afterwards perish in Stalinist terror. A week after the establishment of this political literary jubilee, a more cultural, more academic literary jubilee was established in Leningrad. It was headed by none other than Joseph Orbeli or Yosif Orbeli, who was of Armenian aristocratic background, was born in the Georgian city of Kutaisi, and his academic profile does not fit neatly into the Anglo-American conceptualization of the disciplines or disciplinary boundaries. He was described very often simply as academic. So he was a linguist, he was an archaeologist, a literary critic, and historian. And it is noteworthy that he was a disciple of Nicholas Mark, the spearheading figure of the Soviet linguistic study or Soviet ethnographic studies during most of the Stalinist period, at least until 1950, when his linguistic teaching was repudiated by Stalin himself. So shortly after the establishment of this academic and cultural Jubilee Committee in Leningrad, a conference took place in Leningrad in mid-1934. And during the conference, which was chaired by Joseph Orbeli, Orbeli himself laid down the ideological reinterpretation or the guidelines in the reinterpretations of Ferdowsi's legacy. Some of his disciples also participated, and Ferdowsi was now considered not as a representative of the feudal aristocratic order, but rather a voice of the people. And his background was identified as, well, someone who was of aristocratic background, but someone who resisted Islamization, and some scholars would take it even further to proclaim that Ferdowsi himself was not Muslim or he did not like Islam based on the fact that he wrote in Persian or Farsi as opposed to Arabic, which was a dominant written language as a result of the Islamization of Persia in the early Middle Ages. And shortly after that, in the summer of 1934, a lot of works of Ferdowsi or excerpts of Shahnameh were translated into various languages of Soviet nations. And here's just one publication that came out shortly after that conference in Leningrad that I just mentioned, and you may recognize some of these translators who were poet translators who specialized in translating Oriental works of literature. And there's a discrepancy of the transliteration of the word Shahnameh on the dust jacket and in the front page. So this kind of indicates how haphazard some of these efforts were in the early efforts to celebrate Ferdowsi in 1934. Also, Orbeli himself produced a significant amount of writing. Interestingly, some of the passages and excerpts of Shahnameh that were translated and published during the period of the Jubilee were rather peculiar. Not the best known stories of Shahnameh, but rather stories that Ferdowsi identified as the most influential or the most consequential, specifically for a lot of Persianate people groups of the Soviet Union, particularly in the South Caucasus. And in terms of ideology and in terms of Ferdowsi's background, he was consistently referred to as a dikhan. And this term was known to a lot of, much of the Soviet population because this Persian term entered many languages of Central Asia and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet understanding, a dikhan was a person of lower standing, as you see from this dictionary definition, this is I pulled this from a Soviet dictionary of published in the late 1950s, a Uyghur Russian dictionary. It says крестьянин, земледелец, землепашец was someone who toiled the land. So someone who plowed, who toiled. But in Ferdowsi's historical context, he was what a dikhan was a minor landowner, which would make Ferdowsi very much a representative of the feudal aristocratic order. But this ambiguity actually helped the promotion of the Soviet Union and the identification of him as a man of the people, as well. He wrote in the language spoken by the majority of the people that surrounded him. A lot of his stories were based on Persian folklore and materials, legends, tales that he had collected from the predominantly agrarian population that surrounded him. So the Soviet Jubilee, the Soviet Ferdowsi Jubilee predated the Ferdowsi Jubilee in Iran for about a month. So some of the most extravagant Jubilee events, including a Jubilee Gala that was inaugurated by Abel Enlukhize, took place in September 1934. And here's an image of Bolshoi Theater during the Jubilee. You got the name of Ferdowsi, got the name of Ferdowsi written amidst the columns of the Bolshoi Theater. And because there were not enough crevices to fit in his name, they had to cram two letters in between two pillars of the Bolshoi Theater right here. And this is from the front page of an Armenian Soviet Armenian literary newspaper. It says, well, but where else is Ferdowsi as admired as in the country of the dictatorship of the proletariat, in the kingdom of the emancipated toiling people, in the world of the building of socialism? And here's another indication that this, unlike the 1932 Goethe Jubilee, which I mentioned earlier, this is no longer an event confined to a select group of people, but rather an all people's participatory event. Here's an announcement made in an Armenian language newspaper published in Azerbaijan. It is an announcement about a Jubilee concert or a Jubilee event that would be accessible to the broader population. And in October 1934, the Soviet delegation headed by Josep Orbeli visited Persia and participated in the Jubilee celebrations there. And they made stops along the way, particularly in the South Caucasus, in the capitals of the three republics of the Transcaucasian Federation, Tiflis, Yerevan or Erivan, Baku, where they also participated in the cultural, in the Jubilee events alongside their Persian counterparts before eventually reaching Persia. And throughout their trip, the Soviet correspondents would provide materials for Soviet articles praising the participation of the members of the Soviet delegation. Some would go even so far as to suggest that while the Soviet delegation being the largest, they were also the most informed, the best prepared, and the Soviet delegates, the delegates among all the foreign delegates were the only ones who had some proficiency of Farsi, which was an obvious lie because at least this one other foreign delegate, a Czechoslovak scholar named Jan Rybka, he also participated. He, for at least him for one, had some proficiency in Farsi, and he will later even publish memoirs in the Soviet press with reminiscences of his encounters with members of the Soviet delegation, including Orbeli. So these Soviet correspondents were definitely aware that there were other people who were academically not less attuned or not less engaged in this topic than some of the Soviet delegates. And the end of the Jubilee was not the end of the celebration of Ferdowsi's legacy in the Soviet Union. So shortly before the Jubilee in late 1932, early 1933, Josep Orbeli himself participated in the Second International Congress of Persian Art in London, during which he instigated that the next Congress be held in the Soviet Union, and it was indeed held in Moscow and Leningrad in 1935, which was extremely unusual for the Soviet Union during this period when most international visitors to the Soviet Union, or at least most high-profile scholars that visited the Soviet Union, had left his sympathies. And some of the prominent scholars in Persian Iranian studies coming from the West, including the United States, participated in the multitude of celebratory events. And a lot of these celebratory events actually, or the events of the Congress actually, had some parallels with the Ferdowsi Jubilees because the Soviets were still working out the organizing mechanisms in staging this kind of cultural events. For example, concerts, large-scale exhibitions open to the general public, and so on and so forth. And delegates were given medals, bronze medals, like the one you see on the screen, which were worth a lot of money. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about the celebration of the Shahnameh Jubilee, the Ferdowsi Jubilee in, above all, the South Caucasus. So this is the same Armenian language newspaper published in Azerbaijan that I have previously shown. You got entire pages on this newspaper published for a minority population in not even a Soviet republic, but a republic within a federated republic. Entire pages just, with articles and translations and poems about Ferdowsi and Shahnameh. And here it says, well, the Persian nightingale, the immortal Ferdowsi, which is very telling for reasons I will elaborate on shortly. And I will also like to add that unlike neighboring Georgia and Armenia, Azerbaijan did not have many important cultural institutions such as a university during its brief period of independence from 1918 and 1920, because Azerbaijan was under Bolshevik rule, under foreign intervention and foreign occupation for much of that period during its brief independence during World War I. But many important cultural and educational institutions of Soviet Azerbaijan were first established as ad hoc Jubilee institutions during the 1934 Ferdowsi Jubilee. And in this image, you got Lavrentiy flanked by Nestolakova and the Armenian party chief Agassi Khanjam during the Jubilee celebrations. And this is a newspaper from Abkhazia, which was part of Georgia, with an announcement on the Ferdowsi Jubilee. And in Georgia, the Jubilee took an interesting turn because shortly before Georgia's brief independence during World War I, a lot of scholars had already spent years studying Shahnameh and its influence on medieval Georgian literature. And some of these scholars have remained in Soviet Georgia, and they participated in the literary jubilee by producing scholarly works and new translations. So some of the people listed in this Jubilee, special Jubilee edition of a compilation of verses from Shahnameh, of excerpts from Shahnameh, were scholars who had spent years, if not decades, studying Shahnameh. And they happen to also be scholars working on medieval Georgian literature, including some of the most iconic literary works and literary figures. And similar to the Jubilee events in Moscow, there were also large-scale exhibitions open to the general public that took place in Soviet Georgia. And this event really incentivized the Soviet Georgian intelligentsia to have a new appraisal of their own literary heritage. During the Jubilee, some of these scholars started translating medieval works of Georgian literature inspired by themes from the Shahnameh. For example, Visramiani being the Georgian adaptation of that. And I previously mentioned the 1934 First Writers' Congress, which took place in Moscow 2 months before, or 1.5 months before the Ferdowsi Jubilee. During this Congress, the Georgian delegate, Malakia Toroshelidze, spoke extensively about Ferdowsi's influence on medieval Georgian literature, and particularly on the medieval Georgian poet Shotaru Saveli, author of Vebkhist Alsani, The Knight in the Panther Skin. And during the First Writers' Congress in Moscow in 1934, the Bolshevik Party of Georgia passed a resolution to stage a jubilee in honor of the 750th anniversary of the birth of Shotaru Saveli, directly inspired by the celebration of the Ferdowsi Jubilee. And these are caricatures from a caricature journal published in Soviet Georgia titled Nyangi. Nyangi means crocodile, which explained the presence of this figure. So in the image on the left, you got Ferdowsi shaking hands with Shotaru Saveli, even though they lived hundreds of years apart, and not much about Shotaru Saveli was actually known. And you got Ferdowsi holding a scroll of Shahnameh, and Shotaru Saveli holding a scroll of Vebkhist Alsani, and Ferdowsi telling him, well, I hope that your jubilee will be just as grandiose as mine, and I hope that the new singers, new writers, poets of Soviet Georgia will be just as brilliant as you. And in the image on the right, you got Shotaru Saveli boarding a train from Tbilisi to Moscow, and the crocodile, the homonymous journal, asking him, Shota, where are you off to? Well, he had already packed this little briefcase, but he's still asking him where he's up to. So where are you off to? Shotaru Saveli says, well, I'm going to Moscow to attend the first Writers' Congress. And the crocodile says, well, I'm going to accompany you on this journey. And this is the August 1934 issue, and inside this issue, you got a translation of an excerpt of a poem by Heidi Hein on Ferdowsi. And right next to this poem, you got an announcement of the Rusaveli Jubilee in, well, not only in Soviet Georgia, but it was because it was intended to be an all-union, all-peoples Jubilee. And similarly, this is another journal published in that same period, the summer of 1934. You got reports and photographs from the Ferdowsi Jubilee on the right, and right next to it, there's an announcement of the upcoming Shotaru Saveri Jubilee. And in neighboring Soviet Armenia, it took a more sinister turn. So a lot of the same celebratory events took place in Armenia: concerts, public lectures at factories, at collective farms, and exhibitions open to the general population, translations. All of these things took place, but in some of the publications that came out during this period, some scholars of Armenian folklore, more precisely Manuk Abedian and his disciple Karapet Melik Ohanjanyan, wrote some articles on Ferdowsi's influence on Armenian folklore, in which they claimed that Shahnameh inspired a medieval Armenian epic poem, David Sasun Si David. And these two authors would be arrested shortly afterward during the Great Terror. They were eventually released, but they did not publish for many years. And unbeknownst to them, in 1939, Soviet Armenia celebrated its national literary jubilee in honor of none other than the medieval epic poem Sasun Si David, which was refashioned as an ingenious work of the Armenian peasant population, and it was not inspired by any foreign influence. So here are just some, well, these are from a translation of the Rostom and Sohrab excerpt of Shahnameh into the Armenian language, and the painter commissioned to produce the illustration for these translations was Matiro Saryan, a very prolific and very influential painter of Soviet Armenia, who was born in Russia but repatriated, well, in parentheses, of course, to Soviet Armenia following the Soviet invasion of Armenia in the 1920s. So, and these are from the Sasun Si David Jubilee. How am I doing with time? Shall I wrap up? I'm good. All right.
Fascinating.
Thank you. So, since I still have a little bit of time, I can just say a few words about Ferdowsi in Central Asia. So, similar to Georgia before World War I, some Chagatais in what would later on become Uzbekistan, people who promoted Turkic unity in Central Asia, they also took up an interest on Ferdowsi. Most notably, Abdulhamid Chopin, a poet and writer who will later on be identified as Uzbek, he translated some excerpts of Shahnameh into the Chagatai language. And interestingly, well, I will talk about that later. Let's just talk about Tajikistan first. So Tajikistan is one of the three countries where a variant or a dialect of the polycentric Persian language has official status. This fact notwithstanding, in the late 1920s and even the early 1930s, some cultural figures and political figures in Soviet Tajikistan were openly hostile to Ferdowsi's legacy. Some of them would go so far as to claim that Ferdowsi should be consigned to the ash heap of history because of his class background. But one important cultural figure stood out. It is not entirely precise to call him a cultural figure in Tajikistan because he was physically mostly not in Tajikistan, but in two Tajik-speaking cities in neighboring Uzbekistan, Samarkand and Bukhara. Sadruddin Aini, who had previously been a member of the Jadid movement, he consistently argued that Ferdowsi was a Tajik cultural figure, and Ferdowsi's legacy directly influenced Tajik literature, which he himself was identified as a pathbreaker or by the official Soviet press and the Soviet bureaucracy. Here it says основоположник таджикской советской литературы. And for obvious reasons, he participated extensively during the Jubilee events in 1934 and afterwards. And even before Ferdowsi was officially identified as a Tajik cultural figure, he consistently he consistently alluded to Ferdowsi as a Tajik cultural figure. But Sadreddin Aini did not attend the First Writers' Congress in Moscow in the summer of 1934. According to some accounts, he was held in his trip to Moscow from Uzbekistan. And in his stead, the Persian, Iranian-born poet and journalist and political figure, bureaucrat Abu Qasim Lakhuti gave a speech on behalf of Soviet Tajikistan in which he argued about Ferdowsi's legacy on Tajik literature, but short of identifying Ferdowsi as Tajik. This is Abu Qasim Lakhuti with his wife, Cecilia Banu, who was a Jew born in Ukraine. And they collaborated extensively. And after Lakhuti fell from grace and was expelled from the Writers' Union in the late 1930s, they translated they translated many excerpts of Shahnameh from Farsi into Russian. And the Soviet Union actually published the world's, according to a lot of scholars, the world's most extensive compilation of Shahnameh. This publishing enterprise took about a decade. Like they would turn out one volume every 2 or 3 years. And Ferdowsi's ethno-national classification took a turn at the turn of the 1940s, whereas he had previously been identified as a foreign literary figure, Persian, Iranian. At the turn of the 1940s, he suddenly became Tajik. And all the later accounts of Ferdowsi, including encyclopedic entries, would identify him as Tajik as opposed to Persian or Iranian. Stalin himself, according to various accounts and even a transcript, publicly referred to Ferdowsi as an icon of Tajik literature. But interestingly, in many translations of Ferdowsi published even after the turn of the 1940s, the identification of Ferdowsi, the language of Shahnameh, was not as unambiguous. They will variously be Farsi, Persian, or Tajik Persian. And even more interestingly, Tajikistan had its own national literary jubilee in the late 1950s, and it was not in honor of Ferdowsi, but rather in honor of Rudaki, who was born about over half a decade before Ferdowsi. And the reason for the identification of Rudaki as Tajikistan's national literary icon possibly has to do with the fact that, unlike Ferdowsi, who lived mostly under the Turkic Ghaznavi dynasty, Rudaki lived under the region's last Persianate dynasty, the Samanid dynasty. And interestingly, shortly after the Soviet collapse in the year of 1993, the newly independent Republic of Tajikistan staged yet another literary jubilee, not exactly in honor of Ferdowsi, but in honor of the millennium of the composition of Shahnameh. And Shahnameh was translated not only to modern Tajik, but also into many languages of the Soviet Union during the Soviet period, including to Uzbek. And interestingly, the Soviet Union, or legacy of the Soviet Union, further spread Shahnameh and Ferdowsi's legacy beyond the former Soviet space. This is me, and my reaction to a copy of a Uyghur translation of Shahnameh, which I found at Princeton University's library a couple of years ago. And interestingly, the transliteration of Ferdowsi's name, Abul Qasim, was based on the Uzbek equivalent of his name, as opposed to the Farsi original. And as I said earlier, many of you may know this new turn of policy of celebrating national literary figures through the 1937 Pushkin Jubilee. But the Ferdowsi Jubilee was really the one that set the paradigm and institutionalized the mechanism for the future literary events. And not surprisingly, here's an excerpt from an Armenian language newspaper published in the Soviet Union. So right under this announcement of the Ferdowsi Jubilee, you have there's an announcement of the upcoming Pushkin Jubilee. So with this, I look forward to your questions and feedback. Thank you.
That's a good idea. Thank you so much. Really, really fascinating. The only thing I regret is that we should have invited the program on Central Asia to co-sponsor this event.
Yeah, this is not exactly on. Yeah, this is not entirely on Central Asia. I said a lot about the Caucasus because unlike many of the later literary jubilees, this one actually celebrated the commonality amongst various people groups, something that would not recur in many later jubilees. Instead of like the national literary icon of one specific Soviet nation, this one is actually on various nations that shared a Persianate cultural and literary legacy.
And I have a question on that, actually.
Yeah.
So, well, I didn't realize that the kind of, okay, from your talk, it's clear that South Caucasus, like Georgians especially, played the key role right, in introducing Ferdowsi as kind of a representative of the Persian culture, literature, right, into the canon, into the Soviet canon of great writers, poets, and so on. But what happened later? Was Ferdowsi still venerated throughout the Soviet period, or there was sort of some shift there in the Caucasus and kind of maybe some detachment from the Persian culture and kind of stress on the European roots or something like that?
He was definitely still revered and venerated, but not in the same stature that he had been assigned during the 1934 Jubilee. Here are just two examples. So here's from a literary encyclopedia published, if I'm not mistaken, in the late 1960s. And in this encyclopedic entry, it says, well, the Jubilee was in honor of the Tajik poet Ferdowsi, even though when it actually took place, they never referred to him as Tajik. They referred to him as Persian or Iranian. And here's another example. So I mentioned the Rudaki Jubilee, which took place in 1957. And I think this is on the facade of the National Library of the Republic of Tajikistan, named after Ferdowsi. But even in this, monumental compound or ensemble, you got Rudaki at the very center, and he was flanked by Avicenna on one side and Ferdowsi on the other side, which means, well, Ferdowsi was kind of secondary to Rudaki.
Okay, let's open the floor.
Yes, I have one question. Thank you for interesting lecture. Does the celebration of Ferdowsi reflect to Soviet Union model managing empires through culture? What do you think about it?
Managing the Soviet Empire.
Yes,
of course.
Empires through culture.
Of course, it was not as much Ferdowsi's true legacies in, for example, the chronicling of Iran's history through from the ancient period to the Islamic conquest that was celebrated as much the reinterpretations of Ferdowsi's legacy. For example, him basing his literary work, his poem, on materials from the Iranian folklore. At least that was an interpretation. Also, him being a spokesperson of the people, him popularizing the vernacular language, Farsi or Persian, whatever you call that, which was something the Soviets were busy doing in the 1930s, as I showed in the this image at the very beginning of the talk. So here you got 11 titular languages of the Soviet Union. 6 of these scripts had not existed until just a few years earlier, around 1929, with the Latinization campaign. And this poster is from 1939, and in just a few months, these same 6 scripts would cease to exist as they would be replaced by the Cyrillic script. And also, the interpretations have significance on the institutionalization of national culture because, well, national character, the kind of centuries-long struggle of the peasant population against the ruling feudal aristocratic order was a theme that consistently appeared in the Soviet projection of the respective national characters of various Soviet nations, and the reinterpretations that were repeatedly kind of reiterated during the Ferdowsi Jubilee and its immediate aftermath were also something that became integrated into the broader projection of the national characters of various Soviet nations.
Because in that period, for instance, in Kazakhstan, it was tragedy about starving, more than 2 million Kazakh people dying. And certainly in Ashashlik, yes. And it's really interesting that in that time they celebrate Ferdowsi or all that things.
Celebrating not only him, but also a peasant.
Yes.
Yes.
You mentioned.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Diego. It's kind of a shame that the bad weather outside has probably reduced attendance on a very good talk. I have an informational question and a more interpretive one. The first one is, are there any authentic portraits of Ferdowsi from the time that he lived, or is it all just subsequent artist renditions?
Sure. Let me answer this first. So, as I said previously, the main architect of not only this Jubilee, but also the subsequent ones was this individual, Josep Orbeli, and he himself, among other things, was also an archaeologist, and he himself conducted extensive archaeological expeditions, during the imperial period in Anatolia, but also in various parts of the Soviet Union. So he himself actually wrote about, for example, Sasanian gold, wrote about other eschatological excavates that had to do with the Ferdowsi, particularly during the Ferdowsi Jubilee. And he even created a section of Iranian art at the State Hermitage Museum, the former Winter Palace in Leningrad. He was appointed the director of the State Hermitage Museum around the time he was appointed the chair of the Ferdowsi Jubilee Committee in the spring of 1934. And his disciple, a woman named Camilla Trevor, if I'm not mistaken, she did more research on the archaeological evidence from the period of Ferdowsi. So whenever so during this Jubilee, also during the later Jubilees, most notably the Jubilee of Shotaru Saveli, whenever they staged a Jubilee, there was always a section in the exhibitions focusing on the archaeology, and a lot of the publications were on the broader historical period, so the period of Ferdowsi, the period of Saveli, and so on and so forth.
Okay, and the interpretive question is, I'm trying to reconcile what you presented here in your talk with the way that Ukrainian culture and the Ukrainian people were treated in the 1920s and 1930s. And of course, the 1930s, was a concerted effort to destroy Ukrainian culture and people, and in Kazakhstan too. So if there's a common thread, it seems like it is that all nationalities and ethnicities must be bent to the will of the Soviet state. And I contrast that with what was happening in the 1920s, where the nationalities and the ethnicities bent themselves to the Soviet state, but the decision or the process was taken out of their hands in the 1930s. Am I on the right track, or do you need to correct me?
I'm not going to correct you, because from a modern perspective, 21st century perspective, we look retrogressively, we would definitely make the assessment that the Soviet Union destroyed a lot, especially in the case of Ukraine, decapitated the entire Ukrainian intelligentsia. It moved the capital of the country. There were draconian campaigns that fundamentally altered Ukrainian culture, not to mention the physical toll that the Soviet Union incurred on Ukraine through Holodomor and through the Stalinist terror. So, but from the perspective of the Soviets, they were at destroying, but they were also kind of building in a very sinister way. They were transforming these previously largely agrarian nations into new Soviet nations. In other words, the national character of each and every one of these nations would be centered on the Soviet ideology. So Ukraine still existed as an ethno-national territorial unit within the Soviet Union in the form of a member republic, but it was unmistakably, unequivocally a Soviet territory. The Ukrainians were to be transformed into a Soviet nation. The same could be said about the Kazakhs, but not necessarily the same about the people who were entirely erased, like the ones who were subject to collective repression, the ones who were deported en masse. So, yeah,
that's good. Well, you had some really amazing quotations and images, really amazing. If the Soviets were like the youth of humanity, right? Why did they need these old, figures, right? Like Goethe, Ferdowsi, and why did they need to include them into this canon?
That's a great question, because they didn't necessarily have to do that,
right?
And but it is important to foreground this by saying it was in the ideology. Lenin, whom they celebrated, Lenin himself had written extensively about the relevance of historical cultural legacy, so they could co-opt or appropriate this, or instrumentalize this legacy in their own in their own service. And I think this also had to do with the institutionalization of the creative intelligentsia that had previously been people who were active cultural figures who led the new cultural campaigns, who themselves were either non-members, non-party members, fellow travelers, or proletarian zealots whose educational backgrounds were questionable at best. There were two abortive communist institutes or universities, the communist ideology that existed in Moscow, that were both abolished in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And a lot of these people who participated in the production of revolutionary folklore, particularly in the non-Slavic regions, were themselves alumni of these universities and fashioned themselves as literary critics during this period. So I think the promotion of pre-revolutionary, pre-Soviet literary legacy is also a convenient way for them to kind of anchor the new cultural paradigm in a material. Also, in terms of the geopolitical backdrop, the Soviet Union was not the only foreign country that staged a large-scale public celebrations of the Ferdowsi Jubilee. Another country that did so was Nazi Germany, which had just come to power a year earlier. And the Soviet Union was already in an increasingly intense geopolitical competition and ideological competition with fascist Italy, with Nazi Germany during this period. And the Soviet Union would publicly refer to the fascist regimes of those countries as Philistine, and their cultural campaigns as disingenuous, will proclaim themselves, as in the 1932, well, that was before the Nazis came to power, but will proclaim themselves the true custodians of the cultural heritage.
Okay. And there is something religious, it seems to me, in that, when you have they are like sort of new saints, if you don't believe in the Christian God, but there is the kind of this enlightenment and progress and that, right? Like, so there are these spirals of history, and then you build
Absolutely.
up and sort of Dante's, I don't know.
Absolutely. I mean, this was evident in the Pushkin Jubilee, for example. It was also evident in this other caricature that I shared from Soviet Georgia. So this this caricature journal was published in August 1934, the month after just weeks after the First Writers' Congress, and like the month before this Ferdowsi Jubilee in the Soviet Union. And you get all these towering literary figures of Georgian literature. You got Akakits Ereteri, you got David Guramishvili, Alex Vajab Shavela, for example, Shotaru Saveli at the very center. And it actually took me a while to notice these little figures at the foreground. Two little devils. And they were actually, well, if you read these caption like in fine print, they were actually literary critics who published in the Soviet press, and they might have written like unflattering, disparaging things. I need to look more closely into this, but based on the caption, they must have written some like not very positive things about some of these literary figures, including this. Including Akakis Hereditary, who had died just like decades earlier. It's like very much a modern literary figure. And even these figures were kind of immortalized, placed on a pedestal, while these Soviet literary critics were publicly demonized on the front page of a caricature journal. Yeah. So Baratashvili, whom I assume is this canonical Spuramishvili, is like so in Georgian folklore, like a shepherd has this cane or stick, and he's like, well, I'm gonna pass this cane to someone other than like people like you. This guy has a last name, but I should probably look better into the last name. This is not immediately relevant to what I'm talking about here, but here's another conversation. This guy is being chased away, and this other literary critic might be taking a different approach. Instead of like confronting a literary giant, he was like being more subservient, more obsequious, like telling Akakits Ereteri, I'm sorry, I might have written something unflattering about you. Akakits Ereteri will says, and this is interesting, I don't even know who you are, and I don't even care who you are, because, well, my legacy is already immortal. Yeah.
The revolutionary spirit is gone by then.
It is pretty shocking. Yeah, but it's kind of interesting that some other literary figures, such as Vajab Shavela, were not featured here, but it's featured here. I heard things like Stalin himself didn't like a lot of the like kind of more folklorically inspired literary works.
Wow, that's great. Thank you so much,
Thank
Diego.
you.
Yeah, I guess some people couldn't come, but it is recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel, so
Great.
many more can
Thank you.
watch. It's immortalized now.
You're being immortalized too.
Thank you.
So let's give a
Pleasure.
round of applause.
Let me